Hey guys, I'm Ted and I'm here to give you another lecture. And for today's lecture topic, we are going to discuss slave resistance. Not really something that discussed a lot in American history, but there were a number of major and minor events that showed that slavery was not that the slaves did not just lie down and take it without trying to subvert the practice of chattel slavery. But before we begin our lecture proper, I like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the American dream, the pre-Civil War American dream, which was to acquire slaves and to use those slaves to acquire great wealth and great social standing, and to translate your great wealth and your great social standing into power. To join the member, to become a slavocrat, to join the slavocracy. That was the white South's version of the American dream, and really any American, any white American, and even Native Americans, you can that was the dream, to acquire slaves and to better your lives and the lives of your family. We also looked at slave master paternalism and all the great flaws in that, and how it eroded, and how slave master paternalism arose from the very unique and peculiar traits associated with slave ownership. The people lived kind of aloof, and they lived more in line with feudal lords than with any of their contemporaries. That they sort of viewed themselves as the paterfamilias, as the head of the plantation, and they thought of themselves as caring for the will, thought of themselves as really caring for the slaves as members of their own extended family, but their practices, the abject brutality needed to coerce the slaves' labor from the slaves, and then of course the very cold hard business aspect of plantation slavery, that is having to use the slaves as have financial chips, so to speak, to using the slaves as pieces of movable property that can be bartered and sold to cover debts, or just on a whim. Really just undermine the whole notion of paternalism. And of course, the necessary evil argument, in that slavery was necessary to maintain the South's economy, to protect African Americans from themselves, to give something for the white landless Southerners to aspire to. And now that I've sort of just like bumbled or muddled through our recap, I'd like to jump straight into the methods in which slaves resisted slavery. And first off, we'll discuss religion. Religion was a mainstay of plantation life. In certain areas like the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, or the Delta region of Louisiana, where slave imports were steady and consistent until the British abolition of the international slave trade, slave religious traditions resembled those practiced in West Africa. But generally, slaves practiced Protestant Christianity in the United States, being either Methodist or Baptist. And slave owners tended to inculcate Christianity on their plantations with the absorption of the desired traits of obedience, loyalty, and submission to a God-given or sanctioned order, where blacks were subservient to whites, with the reward of freedom coming in the afterlife. Now, slave congregations taught and absorbed a different message. In secret services, self-taught slaves or itinerant free black ministers prioritized liberation on earth, not the afterlife. The biblical tale of the Exodus took on a new meaning, as did the life and career of Moses, had the leader of the Hebrews, who took them out of their sufferings in Egypt. Now, the black churches of the early republic preached to our congregants that they were, whether they were free or slave, north or south, they emphasized that slavery possessed an inherent evil nature, has a wicked institution created by the devil himself. Has good Christians Slaves were bound by their fate to fight sin and wickedness. Hence, every act of subversion, every act of resistance to the slave master and to slavery became infused with a higher purpose. They became the fulfillment of the will of God. Acting against slavery sort of became a crusade within the black community. Now, the history of slave resistance is a long one that includes highlighted episodes and chapters like the Underground Railroad and Nat Turner's Rebellion. However, most acts of resistance went on quietly in everyday life. For example, slaves often stole food from their masters. Noted slave owner George Washington once complained that his slaves were drinking more of his wine than he was. To many slave owners, thievery confirmed in them the belief that it was the very nature of the slaves to be untrustworthy. This again going back to that whole criminality aspect of things. Stealing, at its most basic level, was a knee-jerk response by slaves to being chronically underfed. There was also an element of morality to the slaves stealing from their masters. There was a very passive way of reclaiming the fruits of their labors, taking the master's food from the pantry stores and wine from his cellars. And Washington's claim is really just, sort of like loud boasting lament, something to sort of conjure him as being a benevolent slave master. Because there's a difference between taking an extra biscuit, and taking a bottle of wine. Even nowadays, if someone takes a bottle of wine from you, to be something that you might want to raise, an objection you might want to raise. But even that, taking food from the pantry or wine from the cellars, was one method of resistance. Now, slaves found other effective ways to withhold their labor from the masters. Feigning illness became one way to get out of work duties. Slave communities developed a host of medicinal treatments that not only aided in the recovery, but also made one appear sick. Slaves sabotaged equipment, often breaking farm implements like hoes to get out of field duties. Slave would often have to journey all the way back to the tool storage shed and get another hoe, or wait for the broken one to be fixed. Now, this provided a measure of satisfaction as the slave received a break from his or her labor, and the satisfaction of having beaten the system. Even if a victory was only temporary, these acts were intended to offer a sense of control over one's life in a world where slaves really had none. Now, these acts signified how central slaves and thus slavery was to the Southern and national order of things. Crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar generated huge revenue for the United States. The profits were enormous. Slave masters lusted after these large profit margins. The profits came from the crops, and the slaves raised the crops. When a slave denied access to his or her labor to the master, they exercised a power greater than that of any legal code that the slave master had been given to command the slave. This subversion had to be done very carefully, since slave masters had a host of punishment for slaves caught intentionally breaking equipment or shirking their duties in any ways, from denial of rations and the common whippings to exile. And exile is really just sale from the plantation. That really just paled in comparison to the most extreme instance, such as maiming or execution. Now, few slave masters actually killed a slave, though it was their legal right. From the early 1700s, 1709 in particular, from a Virginia statute, it became a non-punishable offense for a slave master to kill a slave. And indeed, if it became very common knowledge throughout your county or even just your regional community that you were just abjectly killing slaves, you wouldn't be brought up on any sort of murder charges. You wouldn't be declared insane. In the most extreme instances, and this is coming from Louisiana, what would happen would be that your slave property will be confiscated from you and auctioned off. And again, this was simply a simply paper method to make slavery seem less brutal than it often was. In the instances in which someone's slave property was confiscated from them, they really weren't deprived of that slave property. And in some of these auctions, they were allowed to rebid on their property, making very low bids to reacquire all their property. And in instances in which they were barred from placing bets, their family members simply came in, paid for the slaves, kept the slaves for themselves if they couldn't deed the slaves over to them, and if they could deed the slaves over to the original owner who was deprived of the slaves by legal authorities, then they did that. But there was another method of resistance, rather than simply subversion, and that was escape. Now, escape or escaping from one's plantation did not always entail escape to the northern states, Canada, Mexico. Escape was often just leaving the plantation to visit relatives and friends locally, or leaving the plantation to hunt or to fish. Remember, slaves supplemented their diets by hunting and fishing because they were so meagerly fed. Slaves could also escape to avoid punishments or at critical junctions in the crop cycle when all hands were needed on the plantation. The latter served as a form of negotiation, since other slaves typically knew of the runaway's locations and often spirited food and information to the runaway. Now, masters would send the slave to go and negotiate with the slave who had ran away with the runaway. But that did not mean that the master and slave negotiated as equals. Far from it. Punishments remained at the sole discretion of the master, and no master wanted to look inherently weak against a slave. So oftentimes it might be that you negotiated for a certain settlement, and when you came back, the master had reinforcements, normally in the form of the local militia, the local poor white police, who would use their firearms to keep the other slaves at bay, and the master would simply have the white overseers punish that slave for running away to reinforce his superiority, his sole powers, his sole powerful position on the plantation. But escape, and particularly those little escapes, and the ability and the fact that they were able to negotiate their return, does serve to illustrate that the slaves were not totally helpless in their situation. And now, while most slaves made temporary respites from slavery, thousands took charge of their destinies and undertook long-distance journeys to find freedom. Now, the odds of escaping slavery in the South were long. The distance was vast. There was constant white patrols aided by the dreaded bloodhound, and any African American was presumed to be a runaway, and they were stopped by armed patrols of men or patrol bands, and forced to produce documents proving their status as a free person, or proving they had authorization to be away from the plantation. Now, the odds of escape were greater for those in border areas along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, or Maryland and Delaware. Distance, while formidable, did not really deter a lot of slaves. It was estimated that nearly 1,000 to 1,500 slaves made the journey to freedom a year between 1830 and 1850. Now, those slaves who contemplated or participated in the push north to the northern states or to Canada were aided by a network of black and white abolitionists, those who opposed slavery on moral grounds. And this network came to be known as the Underground Railroad. Because of the secrecy inherent to its organization and operation, much of the information about the Underground Railroad had been lost to history. Slaves were the legal property of the owners, and freeing them or aiding them in their quest for freedom was a form of theft and punishable under state and federal law. Now, punishment for helping runaways were severe. For being a conductor, a guide to runaway slaves, or station master, the owner of a safe house for slaves, whites, for their part, risked fines, prison sentences, and arrest. Blacks, for their participation, risked re-enslavement if caught escaping, or if it had been ascertained that they had escaped earlier. Free persons could be enslaved for aiding a slave. Slaves generally stood a better chance of making freedom when led by a free black or a free slave, but whites often led slaves to freedom. Oftentimes, a white abolitionist will pose as the owner of the slave and simply travel broadly and boldly during the daytime, simply being someone who was going to visit relatives or someone who was going on business somewhere, and taking their slave with them. Particularly in the western states, the western territories. You would pass through Illinois. Say you're on your way to Illinois because you have to go to a wedding, or going into, let's say, the Wisconsin territory because you were being stationed by an army post and this was your slave property and you were simply taking them with you. That worked as well, but typically it was a free black or a former slave themselves who could better explain what was happening and how to behave in certain situations to the escapee. Now, the most famous of all of the Underground Railroad conductors was Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet Tubman had been born into slavery on Maryland's eastern shore, and she suffered a devastating injury when her slave master hurled an object at a runaway she was aiding. Now, the attack left Tubman with a deep scar and recurring headache for most of her life, for really the rest of her life. Tubman began her career in 1850 while working as a domestic servant in Philadelphia. She saved her earnings, purchased her sister and her sister's children freedom, and between the 1850s and the outbreak of the Civil War, Harriet Tubman guided over 200 slaves to freedom, while contending with a dead or alive bounty on her and the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northern authorities to assist slave catchers in returning slave runaways to their owners or face criminal prosecution. Now, Tubman created a network of safe houses to escort slaves to Canada and skirt around the Fugitive Slave Act. And that draws to a close our lecture on slave resistance. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys thought about this. Most people find it very interesting because it's never really discussed Harriet Tubman's injury or her scar. Most people, it has to be pointed out when they look at pictures of her. It has to be pointed out that she bore that scar. The story of the scar is also interesting to a lot of people, and the fact that she had those recurring headaches for like the rest of her life, those debilitating headaches for the rest of her life. Those are I sort of jumped the gun there. I was going to ask, tell me what you thought was the most exciting part or the most interesting part of the lecture to you. But still, comment. Let me know if you agree. When I first heard about him, that's what I gravitated to. I thought that was exciting and interesting. So hit like, subscribe, comment, and let me know if you agree with my opinion that Harriet Tubman being subject to those headaches and having suffered that devastating scar, if that was interesting to you as well. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.